a lot of foreign policy experts who are in fact posing the question that apart from, supplying drones or jet engines, can the United States provide more help to counter Chinese aggression, which seems to be becoming a major issue for India at the LAC?
Well, I think it is very important that U.S. officials are now recognizing that the Indian Ocean is a key space for Chinese provocations and Chinese power. And certainly this has long been a concern for India, given China's growing maritime and naval presence in the Western Indian Ocean region. And I think that that's a reflection of how this relationship between the U.S. and India continues to grow, that, we've already seen a lot of focus on the part of the U.S. In terms of what's happening in the Pacific Ocean, and the U.S. and India are part of the Indo-Pacific Quad, which is obviously focused on the Pacific. But I think there's good reason to believe that in the coming weeks and months, you're going to see more high-level discussions between the U.S. and India on the threat posed by China in the Indian Ocean region, as well as indeed the LAC. So I think we're seeing a broadening of the geographic spaces in which the U.S. and India are looking to cooperate to counter the Chinese threat. Now, how that actually happens operationally remains to be seen. But, we've already seen how there's been an increase in intelligence sharing between the U.S. and India. The militaries are working more closely together. Now, this is not an alliance because India, of course, does not participate in the alliance system. So it's a bit of a challenge for the U.S. and India to figure out how to continue to strengthen their defense partnership to put them in a position to counter the Chinese threat outside of the alliance system. But I think that the U.S. and India have come a very long way over the last few decades, especially if you consider that, into the early 2000s, they didn't really have much of a substantive defense partnership. But things have really changed now with all of these foundational defense accords that have been signed and so on.
In fact, as we speak, Michael, the timing remains very crucial because let's not forget the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, was in Beijing, and he's had a very significant meeting which was expected to cool down the tensions existing between the United States and China. Having said that, would that really have some kind of impact on the India-China tensions as well? Will that sort of bring any sort of benefit to India in terms of the tensions? Will the US be able to make a greater impact in terms of its interaction that it's just had with China?
Well, I would argue that one of the reasons why India-China relations have really become quite strained over the last few years is Beijing's perception about a rapidly deepening U.S.-India defense partnership, which is an accurate perception. So indeed, if you look at Blinken's recent trip to China, which was made to try to bring tensions with China down a bit, that could be perceived perhaps as a positive by Beijing. But I think that these are separate issues, separate dynamics that are playing out. And the fact of the matter is that even after Blinken went to Beijing, it's very clear that whereas tensions between the U.S. and China may have come down a little bit, tensions still remain very high, which I think will amplify the importance of and the imperative of the U.S. and India continuing to strengthen their own defense partnership as this, as the challenges posed by China remain very preeminent, and as China's relations with both India and the United States remain very, very strained.
Michael, I'm going to request you to continue staying with me because I'm also joined in by Nicole Brener-Schmitz, who's a Democrat strategist, joining me live from the United States. Nicole, we're talking about the geopolitical scenario in terms of the significant state visit of the Indian Prime Minister. The timing is very significant. Let's not forget that China continues to remain a threat in the Indo-Pacific. It's been expanding, and if not contain China, but the US is certainly trying to bring a balance of power in Asia through India. When we talk about China, countering China's clout, how significant will this entire visit of the Indian Prime Minister be?
Well, it seems to be very significant because China has gone out of its way to make a huge deal about it and has had a lot of propaganda running through the country and their media today. So, in that way, it's already shown it has its significance. But, again, in the U.S., there are a lot of things that are very partisan. But there is a bipartisan agreement that this trip is hugely important. Part of that is the bilateral agreements themselves and some of the advancements that and the conversations that will be taking place. But part of it is a bipartisan agreement that China represents a problem right now. The drones that flew over the U.S. Earlier in the year, and lawmakers on both sides of the aisle with a very wary view of our relations there, and very much paying attention to what is your prime minister going to say during his address to the Joint Congress, and where we go forward.
Right. Michael, if I could bring you in on this, many would want to know, will the United States be willing to offer the kind of support to India when it comes to countering China, even strategically, the kind of support it has provided Taiwan? Many are questioning, should this support only be limited to defense supplies like drones and jet engines? What is the kind of support that India should expect?
Well, I mean, I think that the transactional forms of support, particularly in terms of arms sales, offers of more intelligence sharing, all of this comes with the foundational defense accords, which are in the process of being implemented. These, of course, are the defense deals that the U.S. Tends to sign with its top allies, and it's signed a number of these with India as well over the last few years. So they're being implemented. But beyond that, it gets more tricky because, indeed, as we agree, India is not an ally of the United States because it doesn't participate in that system. And I think that New Delhi has also been rather cautious about how it messages its own desire for different types of support from the United States, particularly when it comes to the LAC issue. China would certainly not want to message to the world that it would welcome U.S. support because for fear that would provoke China even more, which is a fair point. But I think that it's within the defense foundational accords. That's where I think that we're going to continue to see the types of support that that India would like to see. The intelligence information is critical, and we now know that there was a provocation on the LAC back in December. U.S. intelligence provided to India ahead of time allowed New Delhi to push back that provocation before it became more serious. So I think there's an indication of how you could have levels of U.S. support. But I think that here the Russia factor comes into play as well. India continues to rely on military assistance from Russia, at least for now. And I think that Washington would like to make the argument that as the war in Ukraine continues, Russia, being war-scarred, cash-strapped, won't have the capacity.
But Michael, there is data that suggests that India's dependency as far as for defense is concerned on Russia has gone down. Yes, it's only increased as far as energy supply is concerned, but that defense dependency is going down. And having said that, where I do agree with you, I'm sure Washington is only going to try and wean off India's dependency on Russia, something that's going to be very apparent from the kind of defense deals that India and US intend to, in fact, sign on.
I think that Washington is playing a long game here. It does not expect India to wean itself off Russian military support anytime soon. It recognizes that. Okay. But I think that U.S. officials, and I imagine President Biden will make this argument to Prime Minister Modi, they'll say, oh, look, down the road, the U.S. can scale up its support to India, and in due course, it can begin to provide the types of military supplies and weaponry that India has long depended on from Russia. And I think that one thing U.S. officials could point to in that regard is that the deliveries of the S-400 package, of course, the Russian missile defense system, those deliveries have been delayed. They haven't gone through yet because of the war in Ukraine. So that's a data point that Washington can point to. But my point here, getting back to the issue of what can the U.S. provide to India to help it strengthen its capacity to deter the threat posed by China, well, if this trend that you laid out continues to play out, if India continues to reduce its share of arms imports from Russia, and it continues to increase its share of arms imports from the United States, well, I think we could see down the road, India being in a better position to again strengthen its capacity to deter that threat posed by China. But this is a long-term thing. This is not something that's going to change immediately by any means.
Absolutely. Nicole, if I could bring you in on what Michael is saying, do you think that the United States can sort of capitalize on the conundrum of the existing Russia-China relationship? Because we all know that the Kremlin has been isolated by the West during this war, and it has, of course, looked towards Beijing for support. And that remains a conundrum for India when it comes to its policy of non-alignment, especially towards Russia. Do you think that the United States can capitalize on this conundrum?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that what Michael said was absolutely right. This is a long game. The U.S. is looking at this tactically. They know things aren't going to happen overnight, but certainly that this is diplomacy and geopolitics at its top game, for lack of a better word. This is something that the U.S. can certainly use to its advantage, and it can continue to grow this relationship. I mean, this isn't just a negotiation over a defense deal, and it's not just a state dinner. This is a real celebration of the relationship, and almost a tour for the prime minister within the U.S. And it's a moment that a lot of Indian Americans are celebrating and watching and paying attention to. And this is a moment for the U.S. to really establish a more solid relationship now and really give a vision for the future, which ultimately can change the dynamic with Russia and China as well.
Right. Michael, do you think that the United States can sort of, through its support to India, help India counter that kind of challenge which perhaps Beijing can pose if it wants to exert pressure over the Kremlin or, over Russia when it comes to, exercising greater leeway on India, perhaps through Russia, and expect Russia to, in fact, add to the pressure?
Yeah, this is a really interesting point, and this India-China-Russia triangle one is a really critical one. And I think it's quite clear that one reason why one of the various reasons why India is opposed to the war in Ukraine is that it makes it more likely that Russia will become more reliant on China for economic support, and that
absolutely
could give China...
They've in fact declared a no limits partnership when Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin met.
And this, I think the danger here is that this gives China more leverage over Russia, and it could put Beijing in a position where it could essentially pressure Moscow to rein in its relationship with India, to reduce its weapons supplies to India. And the ironic thing is that actually would work out very well for U.S. interest, right? Because that's what the U.S. wants. It wants India to be doing less business with Russia. But my sense is that the way in which the U.S. looks at India vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine is that it sees it doesn't agree with India's position of taking a subdued position, not criticizing, calling out the invasion of Russia, but the U.S. understands that position. And I had said before that it wants to play this long game with India, but I think another thing it may want to do, including at the state visit, is to try to encourage Modi to leverage India's position as a country that has a special relationship with Russia and a good relationship with the Ukraine to do everything it can to, press the sides for a de-escalation. Now, in reality, I don't think Putin has any interest in ending the war, but still, I think that Biden would want to convey that message that India can play a role, even if it is taking the subdued public position. It can play a role in trying to wind the war down. I think that could be a very important message, not just from Biden, but from other senior U.S. officials as well that may meet with Prime Minister Modi when he's here.
Right. Nicole, if I could bring you in on this, Michael's made a very significant point. What do you think would be the U.S. expectation when it comes to this significant state visit?
I mean, look, I couldn't agree with him more. I think that at a state dinner and these relationships and this one-on-one time is the time to have those kinds of conversations. And I think that is where the U.S. stands right now. They don't love that position. They obviously encourage and want allies to speak out and have a firmer hand, but they understand it. And I think that they want to nurture it and have conversations about it. I thought his point to there being other senior officials that have that conversation is a really good one. I mean, we have more and more Indian Americans elected now to all levels of government, but several now to Congress, and those conversations can be really important to happen this week as well.